We're going to have a small, intimate group for this one. Yesterday we had quite a big, large group. You're going to enjoy Carla. She is interesting. She is very conversational and down to earth. I asked her when she wrote her first novel, and she said when she was 6. She wrote 4 sentences, put it together, and she had a plot, and it was her first writing. But she went on to start with short stories, published her first novel in 1983, and she's just very well versed in historical fiction. You will enjoy today's presentation. I'm just going to turn the time over now to Carla. Probably before I do turn it over to her, I hope you know that she has a booth out here where she has her books and also her hand creams and stuff. So, Carla.
It's a pleasure to be here again. I really like coming to the Welsh Festival. It is a privilege to be Welsh. It's a privilege to be invited to speak at a place like this. My subject is the was that is. You could turn that around and also say the is that was. It works either way if you think about it. The pitfalls, perils, and pleasure of writing historical fiction. Before I even start my talk, I have to tell you, I've written 42 novels, and I quit counting the short stories because I only have so many fingers and toes. We joke about that among historians. We all went into history because we couldn't do math. But it's the people I've met. That's totally it. Yeah, the books are great, and there's no pleasure like seeing a book in your hand that you wrote. But it's the people I've met because of that it's been the joy of my life. And I have plenty of ideas yet, and hopefully time to write them all, but we'll see. But I will never retire, because if I retired, what would I do? I'd write, so I don't retire. But the most common question writers are asked, and I've taken an informal poll, is where do you get your ideas? And we've all agreed, those that I've chatted to about this, that we usually just have this kind of blank look and think to ourselves, well, doesn't everybody have ideas like this? And the answer probably is no. But where do they come from? I couldn't tell you. I don't know. Well, I'll give you an example of how crazy it can get. The writer's mind. I do water aerobics in Idaho Falls. We go Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, and we all line up first, for the warm-up exercises. We hang on to the edge of the pool there, and kind of like guppies waiting to be fed, and that's a writer's vision of what this looks like, all of us there. And then there's one exercise where we roll our head down and we roll this way, and then we look over our shoulder. And every time I do that, I yell, "Shark check!" And then we go, "Shark check!" So now because something's back there. That's the writer's mind. Sorry, but that's the way it is. But what forms a story? I mean, what do I base some of these on? They're all based on history, because that's my gig. I have a couple degrees in history, and I love it. When I was in college, I took 2 English classes, and that was enough. I finally had to have somebody tell me what a trophy was. I don't. It's history. When I was working in Fort Union Trading Post in a National Historic Site in North Dakota, it's on the Montana, it is on the Montana-North Dakota border. The parking lots in Montana, the fort's in North Dakota. It was built in 1868 by the American Fur Company, John Jacob Astor's, his bunch. And I worked there in the summers, and I wrote in the winters. But I happened to be out there one winter. We were working on a project, and I needed to be out there. We had some meetings in town. And the ranger office is down in the basement, so I was down there that morning getting things. It was, I think, February, getting things ready for the meeting in town. And I came upstairs to drive to Williston. It's about 25 miles away from the fort. And it was a total whiteout. There was, snow was swirling in all directions at once, as it does in North Dakota. I thought, I got to drive in this. You do in North Dakota because you have to. So I thought, okay, this isn't going to be that bad. I've taken that walk down to the distant parking lot, and it's quite a ways away. I've taken that walk a number of times. I can find the parking lot. And so the fort is surrounded by a wall, 14-foot wall. And so I went out the back door of the fort and started through this blizzard. And I'm on the path, and I know it curves. I got disoriented. I was about halfway down. It is a gentle slope, and there's kind of a ravine too on one side, and the Missouri River is over here. I got about halfway down, and I turned before the path turned. And about 10 feet off the path, I realized I'm not on that sidewalk anymore. I could feel the grass somewhere down there. So I stopped, and you had this momentary panic, honestly, because you've heard the stories how you get off a path and you can be that far away from a house and miss it, and you'll die out there. So all this goes through my mind, you know. I thought, oh, Carla, come on. So I turned around, and of course I couldn't see any footprints. The snow had already covered them. But I walked what I thought was about 10 paces back, and sure enough, I found the sidewalk. I walked it hundreds of times, and angled down, and then pretty soon I could feel where I stepped off the curb. Then I could see the outline of my car in the distance, and got in it. And as soon as I drove out through the larger parking lot, the road did clear, and the drive into town wasn't really bad at all. Now, an ordinary human being will go through that experience and say, "Whoa, I got lucky." I go through that experience as a writer and think, I got lucky, and I could have used this in a story somewhere. I can't waste that terrifying feeling. I just can't waste that. So I did. A couple years later, I wrote a book called, Softly Falling. The title is somewhat ironic. And so I had to think in my mind, okay, what's a good incident that happened in history involving way too much snow? In 1886-87, there was a winter up in the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska. It became called the Big Die-Off. That was the time before it was the time of the open range, and the cattle that had been driven up from Texas, instinctively they start drifting south because they know somewhere it's warmer. And they drifted and died. I think about 90% of all the cattle on the northern plains died during that awful winter, the Big Die-Off winter. And I thought, okay, that's the good time. And then there was something called the Children's Blizzard. Happened a few years, I think 1881. It was kind of the early days of the NOAA, that national, what is it? It's the one that's the weather. I can't remember the acronym now. It's the Weather Service. It was in its infancy. They could tell something was happening. They didn't know what it was. Now we call it a polar vortex. What happened was the morning was abnormally cool this particular day, and it was in November. And so a lot of the kids walked to their schools, and they didn't wear their coats because it was strangely warm. About the time school got out, the blizzard hit. And it hit worst in North Dakota escaped it. It hit there first, so the parents just kept their kids home. By the time Nebraska, by the time that blizzard hit, the kids were walking home from school, a lot of them. And many died. I think a total of 80 kids died on the plains that day. Some were kept in school by their teachers who could see something going on. Even though they could see a house in the distance, the teacher said, "Don't. We're staying," and they forced their kids to stay there. The same thing I had. I could see I could make it out of that fort, but I couldn't. I really wasn't. I was lucky. So that was my subject, and that became Softly Falling, about a school teacher who has to forcibly keep her kids in school. And it's about people on a ranch in southeast Wyoming, and they can't get out of the ranch. The snow is one blizzard after another, and they're finally confined in what is essentially the kitchen and a very small dining room. So yeah, I try to use everything. That was the event. Then I came across another one. One of these, you got to do this. You got to write this. I was part of a historical project with the state of North Dakota, the Historical Society. This was at the time of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, and we had been granted a large sum of money by Senator Dorgan to do a document search. It's called, of the confluence of the Missouri, the Yellowstone and the Missouri rivers, up there where I worked. So we went back to D.C. I was put in the National Archives to do my job, and the lead historian was in the Library of Congress, and we're assembling all this information. Part of what I was to do an infrastructure study of Fort Buford. That's where Sitting Bull surrendered in 1881, right there, very close to the confluence. So I'm there in the reading room. It's a wonderful, vast, impressive room. All these people very quietly. You open up the gray document boxes and you read out, and you write, you photocopy, do whatever you can. I came across this wonderful letter. It's a memo from the post surgeon at Fort Buford in 1878, April 1878. He's sending it to the post adjutant. This is the second lieutenant, who's the lowest ranking lieutenant in the fort, and he's kind of a glorified secretary for the commanding officer. It's a thankless job. Anyway, you got to hear this. To the post adjutant, sir, in compliance with instructions from the commanding officer, I have the honor to report that I have examined the man calling himself Augustus Gustavus God, with a view to ascertain whether or not he is insane. It is not possible for me to pronounce positively upon his case at present, as the symptoms he presents indicative of an unsound mind are such as might easily be feigned, the old Section 8. I would therefore recommend that he be quartered temporarily in the guardhouse and furnish rations until such time as a more definite information can be procured concerning him and his case be more thoroughly investigated. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, P.F. Harvey, P.F. Harvey, Captain and Assistant Surgeon, USA. I started laughing out loud when I read this, because he's trying to decide if some guy calling himself God is insane or not. And I thought, oh, it's hilarious. Now, the ordinary historian, and I did this, it becomes part of the record of what I wrote. I assembled a large report when this was done. But the novelist in me said, okay, this has got to be a short story at least. It became one. In this collection of my short stories, Here's to the Ladies, Stories of the Frontier Army, it's called Casualty at Post, which was a term used to describe typically an officer who was traveling from one post to another, and he's there temporarily. So the protagonist of the story is the post surgeon. And he's from Boston. He's a scientific man with a scientific mind. And this man shows up who claims he's God, and he has to figure out if he's insane or not. Well, Fred right away figures this is crazy. Of course he's not God. But while God is there, strange things start to happen at the fort. So that's the story, and that's where it goes. It goes farther than that. It involves also Sitting Bull and their surrenders as the people are coming back across from Canada, from grandmother land, back to the United States. But became a short story. So yeah, I use history as history, and I use it as total fodder for writing historical fiction. And I love it. Okay, now, looking forward from back then, a couple things historians do, but let's define history. The historian's definition of history is this. History is the study of documents. Now, that sounds really bland, but it's true. That's what it is. If you cannot prove to me with a documented source that something happened, whatever it might be, I won't believe you. I have to have a documented source. That's what history is, the study of documents. But the definition I like probably at least as well, because I believe both of them. David McCullough, that wonderful historian, said this: history is what people went through. So the historian in me goes for the first definition, and I've written some monographs and a few things that I call footnote projects. I'm working on one for this fall. But the second definition is the one that I like as the historical novelist, what people went through. So how do we do that? Okay, historical fiction writers bend time. If any of you saw the movie Dunkirk, I hope you did. A beautiful rendition of the siege and Battle of Dunkirk. The director likes to bend time. There are 3 storylines going. One is a week, one is a day, one is an hour. The hour one is the RAF fighter pilot flying over, trying to bomb the Germans and protect all the British soldiers that are waiting there for some kind of help. The day is represented by the ship that comes out, the little boat that comes out, the yachts, the rowboats, everything the British people brought to Dunkirk to try to get these men off the beach. The week is the story of the Royal Navy trying to do this. There's one point in the movie where all three times come together. It is the same moment for all of them. Christopher Nolan is very good at bending time. We do that too in a book. But here's how we do it. As a novelist, as a historian, when I write, I'm looking back on an event. As a historical fiction novelist, I'm in the event looking out. And that's the challenge. How do you know, or how do you make what you write so accurate that your readers believe it? So what we are, I think, the historical fiction novelist is a tour guide to the past. We're showing you the past. And that's the challenge. A good historical novelist has the same obligation as a good historian to convey a truthful history, but the novelist uses fiction to do it. And there's this great comment by Mark Twain, which I love. The difference between history and fiction is that fiction has to be believable. And you laugh, but it's so true. He was absolutely on the money. Let me give you an example. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were the last two surviving members of what we would call the Founding Fathers. Adams was 90, Jefferson was 82. And as it turned out, they died on the same day. Wow. It gets better. They died on July 4th, 1826. What are the odds? Now, that's history. It's a fact. If a novelist were to attempt that, just to try that, nobody would believe it, because it defies belief. So you see the issue there. And brings you to the next one. It's just fiction. Why not make it up? And some writers, sad to say, do. I can't do that because I know too much history. Can't do that. We readers of historical fiction like history. That's why we read this stuff, I think, pretty much. We're picky about history. An error, a major error, can throw away all your work. Once fooled, we don't usually go back to the writer or to the story even. I'll give you a good example. There's a novel written, it's been several years now. It's called These Is My Words. Some of you may have read it. It's got a great story. Oh, Captain Jack, don't we all love Captain Jack? I was listening to it. I like to listen to books as I travel. I was listening to it, getting more and more uneasy because she had not a clue about the U.S. Army, and that consumes a major portion of the book. The story it takes place as they travel. Who knows why they did this, and I don't get it. Doesn't work really. From Arizona Territory to San Angelo, Texas, through the most dangerous country in America. You're going through Comanche country. This is in 1870, I think, 71. And then they go back again. That's hard enough to believe. I was having a little trouble right there. But then she meets Captain Jack. He is a captain of a cavalry company, or a troop, as they're typically called. She never did call them that. Of a cavalry troop of the 10th Cavalry. Now, if you know anything all about the U.S. Army, the 9th and 10th Cavalry was composed entirely of African-American soldiers. They were excellent soldiers, called the Buffalo Soldiers. Perhaps you've heard of them. In her story, her younger brother has an infected leg and loses his leg at the knee. And when they get to Tucson, I think it is, he enlists in the 10th Cavalry. Come on now. A guy with one leg enlisting in the cavalry, and he's trying to enlist in a black regiment, which will never take him. So I realized right then that this author had no idea about the Army. And then Captain Jack himself finally gets out of the Army, and she says he resigned his enlistment. No. If you're an officer, you resign your commission. But while he was still an officer, he had plenty of time to go visit her and do all these things, which as a captain of a company, you never do. So the woman didn't know anything about the U.S. Army. I quit reading because once I knew that she didn't know anything about a subject I haven't known a lot about, but I can't trust her anymore. So I'll never read another one of her books, which is too bad. She writes a good story, but she doesn't know what she's doing. I quit reading. So you can't make up basic historical facts, because sooner or later somebody like me is going to come along and read it and think, oh no. Okay, so what we're doing, and yet that's part of our job. Factual and fictional fudging, bending time again. I did it. My first novel, I wrote a whole bunch of short stories. And they kept getting longer and longer, and finally I was in Santa Fe picking up a Spur Award for one of my short stories from Western Writers of America. And I was wandering through Santa Fe, remembering an incident that happened there in 1680 with the Pueblo Indian uprising, and thinking, man, that would be a great novel. And I went back to Ogden, and I had 5 little kids. I used to get up early, and I'd write in the furnace room. I'd close the door, typewriter, write in the furnace room. And then I had a full-time job, too. But when you are a writer, you want to write. And any obstacle is, my family, my obstacle. I love them, but, I wanted to write, and I did. But I didn't do anything that would take away from any care that I gave them. But I write this novel, and I come to that point, and it's certainly one of the climax of the novel is the settlers had managed to, they lived on distant haciendas, and they escaped to Santa Fe, and they're in this walled city, and they are attacked by the Pueblo Indians, and it is a ferocious fight. They finally managed to beat back the Indians, and then history tells us that they waited a week before they began what became called the Journey of Death, which took them eventually to El Paso del Norte. The novelist in me says no. The realist in me says no. You beat the Indians back, you leave the next day because you got your chance. So that's what I did in my novel. I bent time, and they left the next day. But you know what? I have never done that again. I regret it a little bit. It's a good story. But the historian in me says, not quite, Carla. Because the reality of it was kind of defied reality in my mind. Anyway, so that's what I did. I confess it. We use something here called verisimilitude. One of those great words. It's the appearance or the semblance of truth. And that's the novelist's greatest tool and the greatest challenge. How true can you get your story and keep it interesting? Because what's important in writing a novel? It's the story. The history's lovely and we enjoy it and it's important, but the story. That's why Captain Jack, and these are my words, it's a good story. Okay, so first thing I think of, and both historians and novelists do this, why do people do what they do? As a social scientist, historian, if you can understand that, you can understand an awful lot about history. Why do people do what they do? Same thing with a novelist. And this is what forwards your plot. Why is she doing this? Why is he doing that? It's got to be reality-based. It can't be something out in left field. Why do you do what you do? What you do, as a novelist, once you set the historical event in motion, you have an opportunity to explore the human nature side of something, and you can do it with dialogue. Can't do that with history. Very few, at least not older history. Now everything's recorded now. It's a little different these days, but I tend to write either in the 18th or the 19th centuries or early 20th century. But to actually get in people's minds, try to think through what they do. Good example, I'll give you one right now. Courting Carrie in Wonderland. I wrote this. I knew I'd write this. We moved to Idaho Falls 4 years ago. We're about 90 miles from the west entrance to the fort of the park. I worked in Yellowstone one summer, and I love it. I worked at Mammoth Hot Springs, which remains the headquarters of the park, as it was back when it was Fort Yellowstone in 1882, when the Army was there. They were there till 1916 in the creation of the National Park Service, blah, blah, blah. They didn't really leave until 1918. But anyway, I knew I would eventually write a story about that. So the scene I set, the very beginning of the book, it's a historical fact. April of 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt and a couple of his friends went to Yellowstone Park on a camping trip. That's pretty early in the season, but they did. And while they were there, it just turns out that the Ford engineers were building an arch at the north entrance, Gardner, Montana. Some of you may have seen that north entrance. A lot of us come in through Idaho Falls, I know, that direction. But they were building this arch, so it just so happens that the acting superintendent was a guy named Major John Pitcher. He knew Theodore Roosevelt, and he went to Theodore's camp, and he said, would you dedicate that arch for us since you're here? It was about partially done at the time. So he agreed to do it. And so that's why it's called the Roosevelt Arch today. But that's where my story begins. And here's where the fun is. Okay, what did I get? Okay, I backed up a little. Anyway, this works. Story comes first. We've talked about that. What if? What if? This is the two words that fuel any writer, fiction or historical fiction or contemporary fiction. So what do we have? I told you now that Theodore Roosevelt's shown up there to dedicate what became known eventually as the Roosevelt Arch. What if, in the course of this decidedly minor event in history, there is a little scene? Suppose, what if a drunken miner wanders up, he has his gun out, he's kind of 3 sheets to the wind, and he approaches the stand where Roosevelt's speaking and kind of brandishes his gun. What if the fort's sergeant major immediately leaps onto the platform and stands in front of Theodore Roosevelt to protect him? The matter is over in seconds, and the befuddled drunk is led away. What if Theodore Roosevelt says to the sergeant major, here's the fiction, it's in the book, Western rough and tumble, Roosevelt said calmly enough. I remember it well from my Dakota days. He held out his hand. Shake, Sergeant Major. Thank you for your vigilance. He gave his toothy grin, the one that signaled to the other dignitaries that all was well. He lowered his voice for Ramsey's ears only. And this little incident will never make it into any newspaper or history book, but you were ready to protect me with your life. Ramsey shook hands with President Theodore Roosevelt. I'd do it again, sir. I know you would. I see it in your eyes. Bingo! I have put a totally fictitious event onto a very real event, and hopefully I've sucked my readers right into April 1903. That's the fun. So what if? Okay, let's keep the what if going. And this is where I get to work. What if there's a sergeant major garrisoned at Fort Yellowstone? That was the highest rank of a non-commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, still is. These guys know everything. Okay, I need to do some research. I have a lot of research on the U.S. Army in the 19th century, so that's helpful. I know right where to look. But there's more. What about the Army in Yellowstone Park? So I began accumulating books on the subject. In graduate school, I learned right away that the first thing you do when you get a history book is you open it up to the bibliography, and you see where the historian got his or her information. And that's where you look for. I still do that. Okay, what if there is a girl working at the Wiley Camping Company trying to earn money for another year at Montana Agricultural College in Bozeman? Okay, I got to find out something about that Montana Agricultural College. It's now Montana State University. And I know they have an archives there because I've looked at bibliographies. So I contact the archives there in Bozeman at the university, and I tell them what I'm looking for, what I need, and I tell them when I'll be there. I need to see the records. They are so kind, very obliging. Okay, what about Yellowstone Park in 1903? Again, I'm checking my records and seeing where a lot of things are archived. There is a wonderful research archives right outside, as part of the Park Service, right outside of that arch, actually. I went there and got everything I needed. Keep going now. Okay, what's the biggest challenge? Okay, we got to have a conflict here. What if, and the conflict is what? Same problem in 1903, that's a problem in 2018. Can you guess what it is? Tourists. You read the old records of the 1903 stuff, tourists acting dumb way back then too. And that doesn't change. So, okay, I need a really high-maintenance VIP woman tourist who's come to Yellowstone Park and demands an escort. Well, it's going to be stuck to poor old Sergeant Major Ramsey Stiles. Okay. What if everybody in the story has a little secret? Okay, they do. And that's how a novel progresses. Okay, the research part. I love that part. But research is the historical novelist's iceberg. I have got to put in a ton of research, a huge amount, because I'm still not totally sure where my story's going. I have a pretty good idea, but I'm not totally sure. So I got to know everything I can about the subject to kind of suss it out. And I spent about a year researching Courting Carey. I spent 2 years researching this book, My Loving Vigil Keeping. I spoke about this I think 4 years ago, about the mine disaster involving an awful lot of British Isles miners, i.e. Welsh, down in Schofield, Utah. A lot of research to get a few facts, because I can't give you everything, because you'll feel like you're reading a history text. What's the fun in that? Because the story always comes first. It does, it has to. So you must know much more than you write. And resist the urge to slam it all in the book. And realize this. Historical figures do not pass through a blank countryside. So not only are you researching your incident, whether it's Schofield mine disaster, you got to know what's going on in the outside world too. Because these people live in the outside world like we do. So they're in the middle of this event, and now we are too, if I'm doing my job right. What's going on? Who's president? Who's the governor of Utah, from the case of My Loving Vigil Keeping? Who's the important person? There's a guy named Jesse Knight. Some of you may be related to him, may have heard of him. Very important character in Utah history. Came west with his widowed mother after his father died in winter quarters. Did some hard work, became eventually a mining magnate. He was one of the early millionaires in the state of Utah, territory and the state of Utah. He was disaffected briefly from the church. Then he had an epiphany, a vision. He was climbing outside an area called Tintic Mining District. It's to the west of Santa Quin, Spanish Fork, Utah, about 40 miles into the desert. And made a great discovery. He was told in this vision, if he would use his wealth and create many companies to help other people find employment, he would never lack. His family would never lack. So he took that at his word and did that very thing. So, what a man. He's a sort of a minor role in the first book, but I could see as I'm going on to my sequel, called One Step Enough, after that song, Lead Kindly Light, which is referred to as the miners' hymn. Lead kindly light amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. So I think I need to find out more about Jesse Knight, so I did. And then all of a sudden the story becomes a little clearer for me, where the story has to go. Because My Loving Vigil Keeping, well, let me get this next idea here. I was expert in her subject, but let me go to this one. You follow the threads that histories and readers provide. Here's where I got really lucky. So the logical step, as the book ends, My Loving Vigil Keeping, Owen Davis has promised his, turns out to be future wife, that he will not go in another coal mine. He's done with mining. He had a fraud experience, lost 200 of his friends and dear people to him. And he's made that promise, but he's a miner. And there's something called the lure of the mines. Can he keep that promise? We got one major conflict starting right away, really. And understanding why do people do what they do? That's what coal miners mine coal. It's also a story about grief, because he is mourning his friends, thinking if I can work in a mine and make them safer, other miners will be better off. That's how he's mourning his friends. Her father had died in a hard rock mine disaster in the Colorado Plateau when she was 12. And this incident at winter quarters, Schofield, has brought back vivid memories of her father's death when she became an orphan, essentially, and was sent to relatives in Salt Lake who were nasty people. So, and she was not allowed to mourn her father because he was the family black sheep. He'd gone to the mines. He fathered this child, and the mother had abandoned her. And we find out that's not true. Anyway, so here we are. There's my story. I got lucky here. I got really lucky. Because after I wrote My Loving Vigil Keeping, and I'm writing the sequel, people who are related to the people I wrote about contacted me to tell me more. Oh, I can't believe how fortunate that was. One family, Dr. Emil Ice-Green, has an important part in the story. He's a rival for Della's affections, and he and Owen have a very polite rivalry going. Owen wins. But Emil Ice-Green figures in the next story rather prominently. I was volunteering at the museum there in Helper, the Western Mining and Railroad Museum. I got a call one day at the fort at the museum from a guy named Bob Johnson. Bob introduced himself. He said, "I'm a son-in-law of Dr. Ice Cream." I said, "Son-in-law?" I'm thinking, how old are you? As it turned out, Dr. Ice Cream didn't marry until 10 years after the mine disaster. He met a woman from Logan. He was 43 when he married, and this daughter that Bob married was the fifth and last child. So you're seeing what's happening here. We have a kind of a time where you skip a generation. You know, it happens. It happened in this case. So he knew Dr. Ice Cream, knew him well. Bob at the time, I think he was 90. He's 94 now, I think. Great old guy. So I met him, and I met his son and one of his daughters. We had breakfast there in Wellington, Utah. And he told me more about Dr. Ice Cream. He told me about something I had heard about and had not been able to find it. Dr. Ice Cream wrote an account of that event, of the Schofield mine disaster, when he was very old. And I didn't know how to get a hold of it. Didn't know how to get a hold of it at all. So I mentioned it to Bob, and Bob said, "Oh, I got a copy. I'll send it to you." So he did, and I have it today. Wonderful copy. Happily, I did it pretty well in the novel. I didn't goof up too much. But he told me more. He told me this about Dr. Ice Cream. He said he lived by this precept: there is always satisfaction in a duty performed and a noble deed done. So that was Dr. Ice Cream. That colors what I wrote about him in the next book, One Step Enough. Then I got really lucky again. I heard from a fellow named Doug Kero. That's Kero. It's a Finnish name. He is a direct descendant of Mari and Heikki Luoma, who are in my story as newlyweds. They come from Finland. The Luoma family lost hugely in the mine disaster. I think 7 sons, grandsons, nephews. You know, it was that kind of a disaster. Doug contacted me, and he had read the book and passed it around, and so the Finnish community was aware. He corrected my errors. I made some big ones. You have to decide how much time are you going to devote to essentially minor characters. They're important to the story, but they're not major characters. And the fact that most of these women after the disaster remarried, and I have new last names that I have no idea who they are. So all I can do is kind of work on what I think I know. He set me straight. When Mari and Heikki came to the U.S., they already had 2 children. Let's see, the first one was Rauha. In English, she was called Ellen. That's Doug's great-grandmother. Rauha, she was 4 at the time of the mine disaster. And her brother Juho, who was 2. And the third child of the couple was born after Heikki had died in the mine disaster. His name was, she named that son after her dead husband, Vittori Heikki Luoma. They called him Victor. He ran the farm. He told me this. After Victor was born, Mari moved to Belt, Montana, which is close to Great Falls. It was a site of the first coal mine in Montana. She married a man named Adolf Hill. His real last name was Balila. A lot of times names got changed when people came to the U.S. And they bought a farm, a dairy farm, over in Menlo, Washington, right by Seaside, Oregon. It's kind of on the border. And they farmed there, and they had children of their own. And Doug said he still owns land he has land, he has 5 acres that he has a cabin on that was on the old homestead. So thank you. So yeah, it colored my story. I learned more from people who have told me more. Then there was a fellow named Craig Johnson. Craig's a lawyer in Salt Lake City, and he's interested in mining history. So he connected me with a fellow named Nick Castleton, who is the mayor of Eureka, Utah. His family's been there since 1900, and Nick knows everything about the mines. And so he took us it was kind of as cold and rainy, and we were on those ATVs, 2-seat front, 2-seat, I don't know, you know what I'm talking about, quads, they call them in Canada. And so we went to all these areas, we went up to Knightville, that was the old settlement that Jesse Knight created, and did all this, and he gave me all this information. In fact, he very kindly read part of my manuscript, because I am no expert on hard rock mining. So yeah, I learned about these things from people who contacted me. I was lucky, and I know it. So I delved further into Jesse Knight's life, and he had a lot of business going on in Canada at this time. Not to give away the next book or anything, but I think we're going to find our people head maybe to Canada. So totally logical, because it all fits the story. I made it fit because history is there for the taking, and it can definitely further a plot and a story. He was far more than a minor character in the next book, and I learned a lot. It's a blessing thing. And so a novel comes to be. All the parts become a whole. I've done the best I can with the facts I have, and then I'm happy when people tell me more. I kept the story itself as the most important part. I try to do that in all my novels, naturally, because I've learned how to deliver just enough history without overwhelming the story of people. What people went through. That's what they're going through. Coping with disaster and change and looking ahead with optimism. The great reward, in addition to all the people I've met, including Jean, a lot of people, a lot of readers, is this comment. I've had other comments. One comment I like, as I got closer to the end, I consciously slowed down because I didn't want it to end. Another one, I learned something. So did I. And the last one, I told the kids to fix their own meals because I was busy reading. You know, that is success for a writer. Thank you. I don't know what time I had here, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Any rebuttals? Any relatives that I maligned in my stories, Jean?
Are you contemplating continuing the story at this point?
No, not right now. You know, I could, because that sugar factory up there eventually went away. What do we do then? There's always more, but right now I'm on book 2 of a series I started called The Unlikely Master Genius. Oh, it's a good book. I loved it. It was fun to write. It's fun to even reread. And then I'm thinking about a Civil War trilogy with the Union gunboats on the Mississippi, and then Gettysburg, and then Sherman's March to the Sea. So he's got a lot of writing to go yet. Any other questions? Yes, Melvin.
Just from a kind of nuts and bolts standpoint, when you were first starting to research an era, where do you like to go to find the primary sources?
Again, it's those. I look at that bibliography, but I'll tell you, when I was writing My Loving Vigil Keeping the Mind book, I like to go to children's books, finding a children's history, because they have illustrations and it's simply told, and I get a visual image that really, really helps me. In fact, if I were my original definition of history is a study of documents, I would add history is a study of photographs. And looking at everything around, not just the main part of the photograph, but everything around it. So that helps me. I get this visual picture when I look at children's books. I've done that a number of times. It's very useful. But I don't stop there. That's where I start often. Any other questions? Well, thank you for your time. I got books out and books out there and hand cream. When I get tired of writing, I make hand cream. So that's my deal. Thank you so much.
Just a reminder of it. Carla, thank you.
Oh, you're
That was just, I enjoyed listening to it both days. The adult poetry reading will be here this afternoon at 1 o'clock, and then the piano duet concert at 3 o'clock. Make sure you get down to the Cultural Hall. You get to see lots of pictures down there. And then tomorrow evening will be the fireside. It's the Haywire Ranch String Band will perform Western songs as if on a radio broadcast along the Pioneer Trail in the 1860s. So that will be a lot of fun. That will be at the Presbyterian Church. There will be 2 performances, one at 5:30 and one at 7 o'clock, and refreshments will be served. Enjoy the afternoon. Lots to do.
For more information about Carla Kelly, please consider visiting her website, carlakellyauthor.com. Her books are available for purchase on Amazon. Links are in the description down below. If you'd like to know more about the Malad Welsh Festival, please visit our Facebook page, give us a like, send us a message, or visit our website, welshfestival.com. Thank you for watching. Oh, I hope that master audio took all right.
Yeah, you're in trouble if it did.
Oh, yeah.